The metal door slammed shut for the final time. But this wasn't just another day at Riverside Correctional Facility. This was the day everything would begin to unravel. A corrections warden with 23 years of spotless service. An inmate with secrets buried deeper than anyone could imagine. And 47 days that would end in betrayal, infection, and murder. Some stories make you question everything you thought you knew about trust, about desperation, about the choices people make when they believe no one is watching. This is one of those stories. Because what started as stolen glances across a prison yard would end with 3 lives destroyed, a community torn apart, and questions that still haunt everyone who knew the truth. When 6-year-old Maya Collins arrived at Riverside Correctional Facility on a Tuesday morning in March, nobody could have predicted she would become the center of one of the most disturbing prison scandals in the state's history. Welcome to Silent Witness True Crime Stories. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe, and also download your free ebook by clicking the link in the pinned comment. Those prison doors. She was quiet, almost unnaturally calm for someone facing a 3-year sentence for fraud and identity theft. The intake officer would later tell investigators that Maya seemed disconnected, like she had already accepted whatever fate awaited her behind those walls. She was a transgender woman, and that single fact would complicate everything about her incarceration. Maya was placed in a special housing unit for her own protection, and that isolation would become the breeding ground for everything that followed. She spent her first week observing everyone and everything. She watched the guards, memorized their schedules, noticed who was strict and who was lenient. She was intelligent in a way that made people underestimate her, because she never spoke unless spoken to, never caused trouble, never drew attention to herself. But Maya was always watching, always calculating, and she had a secret locked away in a sealed medical file that only prison medical staff could access. That secret was about to change multiple lives forever. David Mitchell was 49 years old when Maya Collins entered his life. He had been a corrections officer at Riverside for over 2 decades, working his way up to senior warden through dedication and discipline. His colleagues respected him. His supervisors trusted him. His wife of 26 years believed in him. David was the kind of man who arrived early and left late, who knew every regulation in the handbook, who had never once been written up for misconduct. He was dependable in a world where dependability meant everything. But David Mitchell was also lonely in ways he didn't admit to himself. His marriage had become silent dinners and separate bedrooms. His children were grown and living in different states. He told himself he was content, that this was just what life looked like at his age. But somewhere deep inside, David was starving for connection, for feeling valued, for proof that he still mattered beyond his job title. That hunger made him vulnerable in ways he never recognized until it was far too late. The first time David really noticed Maya was during a routine cell check on her 8th day at Riverside. He was walking through the special housing unit when he passed her cell and she looked up from her book. Their eyes met for maybe 3 seconds, but something in that moment felt different. She didn't look away like most inmates did. She held his gaze with a quiet confidence that unsettled him. Over the following weeks, David found himself walking past Maya's cell more frequently than necessary. He told himself he was just doing his job, but he knew better. They didn't speak beyond standard exchanges, but a silent conversation was happening, one built on glances and proximity and unspoken questions. It was Maya who made the first real move, but she did it so subtly that David could convince himself it was innocent. She began asking him questions during his rounds, simple things at first about the library, schedule, or recreation time. Her voice was soft, almost musical, and she had a way of making every interaction feel personal. David found himself lingering at her cell door, answering her questions with more detail than necessary. These conversations started lasting 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. Maya asked about his life outside the prison. She listened when he talked about his frustrations at work. She seemed to understand him in ways his own wife hadn't in years, and slowly, without David fully realizing it, Maya Collins was becoming the most important person in his daily life. By the 6th week of Maya's incarceration, The line between professional and personal had completely blurred. David was finding excuses to see her, to talk to her, to spend time in her presence. He started volunteering for shifts in the special housing unit, even when it wasn't his assignment. The conversations grew deeper, more intimate. Maya told him about growing up different, about the rejection she faced from her family when she came out as transgender, about the violence she experienced that eventually led to her turning to fraud just to survive. Her stories broke his heart. She wasn't a criminal in his eyes anymore. She was a victim who deserved compassion and protection. David started to see himself as that person. He knew he was crossing lines he shouldn't cross, but every time he thought about pulling back, Maya would say something that pulled him in deeper. She told him he was different from other guards. She told him she felt safe with him. She told him she thought about him when he wasn't there, and those words fed something in David that had been empty for so long. The affair began on a Thursday night during David's evening shift. The prison was understaffed, a common occurrence, and he found himself alone in the special housing unit for nearly an hour. The conversation with Maya turned more personal. She told him she had been having nightmares, that she felt scared and alone. David asked what he could do to help. Maya said quietly that she just needed to feel human again, to be touched by someone who saw her as a person rather than a number. That statement should have sent David walking away immediately, but instead, he felt his resolve crumbling. He unlocked her cell door and stepped inside. They stood facing each other for a long moment, and then Maya reached out and took his hand. David knew he should leave, knew he was violating every rule he had ever taken, but he didn't move. Instead, he pulled her closer. What happened next was a choice they both made, one that would have consequences neither could have imagined. The affair continued for 3 weeks. David and Maya found ways to be alone together, stealing moments in storage rooms, in empty offices after hours, in her cell when the facility was short-staffed. They were reckless. David was risking his career, his reputation, his marriage, his freedom. Maya was risking additional charges and years added to her sentence, but in those moments together, none of that seemed to matter. David felt alive in a way he hadn't in decades. For Maya, the relationship was more complicated. She was genuinely attracted to David in some ways, but there was also a transactional element she couldn't escape. She needed protection in that prison. She needed someone on her side. Whether the affair started as manipulation or evolved into something real is a question even Maya herself probably couldn't have answered honestly. But one thing was certain: she was keeping a secret from David, one that would destroy everything when it finally came to light. The first crack in their secret world appeared when Officer James Porter started noticing David's behavior. James had worked with David for 12 years, and he knew something was off. David was distracted, constantly checking his watch, spending too much time in the special housing unit. James mentioned it to another officer, and those kinds of comments spread quickly in a prison. Within days, multiple officers were paying closer attention. They noticed the way David looked at Maya. They noticed how long he spent at her cell. One officer claimed to have seen David exiting a storage room with his uniform disheveled. Another heard voices coming from an empty office late one evening. The whispers grew louder, more specific, more damaging. David felt the walls closing in, but convinced himself nobody could actually know. But they hadn't been careful enough. Nothing stays secret in a prison for long. The moment everything changed came during a routine medical screening in Maya's 7th week. She had been feeling ill for several days, experiencing fatigue and night sweats. The medical staff insisted on running blood work. Maya tried to refuse the testing, became agitated and defensive in a way that raised red flags. The nurse pulled Maya's sealed medical file, the one marked confidential upon her intake. What the nurse found made her blood run cold. Maya Collins was HIV positive. She had been diagnosed 2 years before her incarceration and had been on medication, but her adherence to treatment had been inconsistent. The medical notation indicated her viral load had been detectable at the time of her arrest, meaning she was potentially infectious. The nurse immediately reported this to the prison's medical director, who then had to notify the warden. Nobody knew yet that David Mitchell had been exposed, but the investigation that was about to begin would uncover everything. When Internal Affairs received an anonymous tip 3 days later about a sexual relationship between Senior Warden David Mitchell and inmate Maya Collins, the pieces started falling into place in the worst possible way. The tip was detailed, included specific dates and locations. Internal Affairs moved quickly, pulling security footage, interviewing staff, reconstructing timelines. What they found was damning. The footage showed David entering Maya's cell on multiple occasions outside of any legitimate reason. It showed him accessing restricted areas at odd hours. When they brought David in for questioning, he initially denied everything, but when confronted with the evidence, his defenses crumbled. He admitted to the affair. He broke down in the interview room, crying, talking about how lonely he had been, how Maya made him feel valued. But then the investigators told him something he didn't know yet. Maya Collins was HIV positive. David's face went white. He asked if they were sure. David's next question came out in a whisper. Did she know she could transmit it? The investigators didn't have to answer. The look on their faces told him everything. David Mitchell was immediately placed on leave and escorted from the facility. He was advised to seek medical testing and given information about post-exposure prophylaxis, medications that could potentially prevent HIV infection if taken within 72 hours of exposure. David sat in his car in the prison parking lot for nearly an hour, unable to process what had just happened. His career was over. His marriage would likely be over once his wife found out. But those concerns felt distant compared to the terror about his health, about the possibility that he had been infected with a virus that would change his life forever. Had Maya known she was putting him at risk? Had she deliberately kept this from him? These questions haunted him as he drove to an emergency clinic, as he underwent testing, as he started a month-long course of preventive medications that made him violently ill. The waiting period to know if he had been infected would be 6 months of agony. Back at Riverside, Maya Collins was in her own personal hell. The investigation had exposed her relationship with David, and the consequences were immediate and severe. She was moved to administrative segregation, a form of solitary confinement, for her own protection and as punishment. She lost all privileges, all contact with other inmates. She spent 23 hours a day in a cell barely bigger than a bathroom. Did she feel guilty about potentially infecting David? Sources say she expressed remorse, but it's unclear how genuine that was. Maya claimed she had assumed David knew about her HIV status, that she thought medical staff would have informed him. But the medical records told a different story. Her file clearly indicated she had requested her status be kept confidential. She had known, David didn't know. She had made the choice not to tell him. The prison population learned about the affair within days, and the reaction was brutal. News spread that a warden had been sleeping with an inmate, that the inmate was transgender, that she had HIV, that the warden might be infected. Maya became a target. Inmates shouted threats at her through the walls. Notes were passed, threatening her life. The correctional staff heard the threats, but many of them were angry too, angry at Maya for what she had done to one of their own. There was a sense that Maya deserved whatever was coming to her, a dangerous mindset in a place where violence could erupt at any moment. The prison administration increased security around Maya, but protection in a prison has limits, especially when both inmates and staff have turned against you. Officer Marcus Webb had worked at Riverside for 6 years, and he had his own reasons for hating Maya Collins. Marcus had been one of David Mitchell's closest friends at the facility. They had gone through training together, had worked countless shifts side by side. When David was placed on leave and the scandal broke, Marcus felt betrayed. He had looked up to David, and watching him fall apart over an inmate made Marcus furious. But his anger wasn't directed at David. Instead, Marcus blamed Maya entirely. He saw her as a manipulator who had destroyed a good man. Marcus started talking about Maya to other officers, spreading stories that may or may not have been true. He said she was bragging about the affair, that she was laughing about infecting David. Marcus became increasingly obsessed with the idea that Maya needed to be punished beyond what the system would do to her. He talked about justice, about making sure she understood the consequences of her actions. His colleagues should have recognized these statements as warning signs, but many of them shared his anger. On the 47th day of Maya Collins' incarceration at Riverside Correctional Facility, something went catastrophically wrong. At approximately 2:15 a.m. during a night shift, Maya was found unresponsive in her segregation cell. The officer who discovered her called for medical assistance, but when the prison medical team arrived, it was already too late. Maya Collins was pronounced dead at 2:47 a.m. The initial report listed the cause of death as suicide by hanging. The prison administration moved quickly to control the narrative, releasing a statement that suicide attempts are unfortunately common in correctional facilities, especially among inmates in segregation. David Mitchell heard about Maya's death through a text message from a former colleague. The news hit him like a physical blow. Whatever anger he had felt toward Maya disappeared in that moment and was replaced by grief and guilt. He had loved her, or believed he loved her, and now she was gone. He would never get answers to his questions, never understand why she hadn't told him about her HIV status. And somewhere in his mind, he couldn't escape the thought that he was responsible, that his selfish choices had put Maya in danger. But not everyone believed the official story. Maya's family, who had been estranged from her for years, suddenly reappeared and began asking questions. They hired a lawyer who requested an independent investigation. They pointed out that Maya had never shown suicidal tendencies during her incarceration, that she had been making plans for her future, writing letters about what she wanted to do when released. Why would someone making plans suddenly take their own life? The lawyer also raised concerns about the timeline. Maya had been under constant surveillance in segregation. How had she been able to hang herself without being discovered? Where were the officers who should have been monitoring her? And why were there inconsistencies in the incident reports filed by different staff members? The independent autopsy commissioned by Maya's family revealed information that contradicted the prison's official findings. The forensic pathologist found injuries on Maya's body inconsistent with suicide by hanging. There were bruises on her neck that suggested manual strangulation rather than ligature marks. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, small cuts that indicated she had been in a struggle. Most damning, there was evidence of blunt force trauma to her head that occurred shortly before her death. The pathologist's conclusion was unequivocal. Maya Collins' death was a homicide, not a suicide. She had been killed by another person, and based on the nature of the injuries and the location of her death, that person had almost certainly been someone with access to her segregation cell, someone who knew how to avoid surveillance cameras, someone who understood prison protocols. In other words, the killer was likely a corrections officer. The revelation that Maya's death was a homicide sent shockwaves through Riverside and the surrounding community. The state's attorney opened a criminal investigation, bringing in outside detectives. Every officer on duty that night was interviewed. Their movements were tracked and analyzed. The investigation focused heavily on Marcus Webb, whose hostile statements about Maya had been reported by multiple colleagues. Marcus initially denied involvement, claiming he was nowhere near Maya's cell that night, but the evidence told a different story. Security footage showed Marcus entering the segregation unit at 1:58 a.m., 17 minutes before Maya was found dead. His entry was logged, but there was no corresponding exit log for nearly 30 minutes. When detectives searched Marcus's locker, they found a handwritten note that read, "Justice served," dated the morning after Maya's death. When confronted with this evidence, Marcus's story began to change. He admitted he had gone to Maya's cell, but claimed he only wanted to talk to her. He said Maya had become aggressive, had attacked him, and that he defended himself. But the forensic evidence didn't support that narrative. Maya's injuries suggested she had been restrained and strangled from behind, a technique that matches what corrections officers learn during defensive tactics courses. The trial of Marcus Webb lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented evidence that Marcus had been planning Maya's death for days, waiting for an opportunity when he would be on night shift with minimal oversight. They argued Marcus had entered Maya's cell, confronted her, and when she tried to call for help, he attacked her, using a chokehold that cut off her air supply. He then staged the scene to look like a suicide, hanging Maya's body with her bedsheet and waiting several minutes before calling for help to ensure she couldn't be revived. Marcus's defense team argued he had been provoked, that his mental state had been compromised by what Maya had done to his friend. They painted Maya as a manipulator who had destroyed David Mitchell's life. The strategy was risky and morally questionable, but it played on prejudices that some jury members might have held about transgender individuals and people living with HIV. The verdict came back after 2 days of deliberation. Marcus Webb was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury had seen through the attempt to blame Maya for her own death, but they hadn't been convinced of premeditation, which is why the charge was reduced from first degree. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read. Marcus's conviction brought some measure of closure to Maya's family, but it raised more questions than it answered. How had a corrections officer been able to murder an inmate in a cell that was supposed to be under constant surveillance? Why hadn't the warning signs about Marcus's behavior been taken seriously? And what responsibility did the prison administration bear for creating the conditions that made Maya's death possible? David Mitchell's HIV test results came back negative 6 months after his last contact with Maya. The post-exposure prophylaxis had worked, or he had simply been fortunate, but either way, he had not been infected. That news should have brought relief, but David felt nothing. He had lost everything regardless. His wife had filed for divorce. His children wouldn't speak to him. His career was over. David moved to a different state, changed his name, tried to disappear. In rare interviews given years later, David would talk about his profound regret, about how he had allowed loneliness to destroy his judgment, about how he had failed Maya. But people who knew him said he was haunted by her memory, by the what-ifs, by the knowledge that his selfish choices had set in motion events that ended in her death. The Riverside Correctional Facility underwent significant reforms following Maya's death. The warden was replaced. New oversight systems were implemented. Additional cameras were installed in segregation units. Training programs were enhanced to address vulnerabilities faced by LGBTQ inmates and those living with HIV. But many advocates argued the facility was just going through the motions, making symbolic gestures without addressing deeper problems. Maya's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state. The case was settled for an undisclosed amount. That money couldn't bring Maya back, but her family established a foundation in her name to advocate for better treatment of transgender individuals in the criminal justice system. The story of Maya Collins, David Mitchell, and Marcus Webb is a case study in how individual choices, systemic failures, and societal prejudices can intersect to create tragedy. Maya made choices that put someone else at risk. But does that mean she deserved to die at 26 years old, murdered by someone who was supposed to protect her? David allowed loneliness to compromise every value he had ever held. He violated his oath, broke the law, betrayed his family. But was he a predator? Or was he simply a broken person who made catastrophically bad decisions? Marcus Webb took a life in a moment of rage and misguided righteousness. He appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. These 3 people came together in a perfect storm of poor judgment and human frailty, and the result was a tragedy that could have been prevented if someone had made a different choice. How do you think about a case like this? Can you understand what drove each of these people to make the choices they made? Do you feel sympathy for Maya, who was killed while serving time for a non-violent crime? Do you feel sympathy for David, who lost everything because he was lonely? These questions don't have easy answers. Real life is messy and complicated, and full of people who are both victims and perpetrators, sometimes at the same time. If you were in Maya's position, isolated and scared, would you have told someone about your HIV status even if you thought it might end a relationship that made you feel safe? If you were in David's position, lonely and feeling invisible, would you have had the strength to walk away? If you were in Marcus's position, watching someone you cared about be destroyed, would you have controlled your anger? These questions force us to think about how easy it is to judge from the outside, how different things look when you're living inside a situation. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this case as complex and disturbing as we did, wait until you see what we have coming next week. Until then, stay safe. And remember that the choices we make have consequences we can't always predict or control.